Welcome to the Aced It podcast, where we turn science into sense. As we begin our 11th season, I wanted to let you know that Jcoin has a new O. That's right. The formerly Justice Community Opioid Innovation Network is now the Justice Community Overdose Innovation Network. Same wonderful network, same awesome podcast, but with a broader emphasis. So I am so excited that you're with us. I'm Danielle Rudes, your host, and this is Aced It. Welcome to episode 10, the final episode of season 11 of the Aced It podcast. On the final episode of our season on substance use disorder, overdose, and loved ones, we're talking all about support groups and treatment for the loved ones of people with substance use disorder and overdose incidents. So far on the podcast, we've touched on how substance use disorder and overdose impacts loved ones, but we haven't specifically talked about the support and treatment available for people who have lost someone to an overdose or who have family and friends struggling with addiction. Before we talk about this, let's recap what we've learned over the course of this season. On episode 1, I gave you a brief overview of the season, and I reviewed some of the research that investigates addiction, overdose, and loved ones. Then, in the next few episodes, we talked about parents' experiences, children's experiences, siblings' experiences, intimate partners' experiences, and friends' experiences. One of the takeaways from these 5 episodes was that the loved ones of people with substance use disorder and overdose incidents are really struggling, particularly with how to support someone in the midst of addiction and how to navigate complex feelings of grief after someone has passed away from an overdose. Then, in the next few episodes, we talked about involving loved ones in addiction overdose treatment, having unhoused loved ones with addiction overdose incidents, and addiction and overdose in the context of rural areas. These episodes also touched on the stress and sadness that people feel when someone they love is misusing substances. Now, we've arrived at the final episode, and it's time to talk about how we have and should support people who have a loved one with an addiction overdose incident. All right. So in previous episodes, particularly those centered around bereavement experiences after a drug-related death, we've discussed studies that looked at coping mechanisms after loss. Some people rely on their partners, friends, or relatives, and others seek out formal support and treatment organizations and therapists. There are a few studies that look specifically at treatment types and impacts, though, and today I want to tell you about those studies. 3 studies look at the formation and impact of peer support programs. 1 study looks at therapy techniques to help people navigate grief after a drug-related death. And the final study looks at the challenges of accessing support in general. First, let's start by actually talking about that last article, since it takes a broader approach than the other 4. In 2022, Kahn and colleagues published an article that looked at family experiences with treatment services when supporting a young person seeking substance use disorder care. Through in-depth interviews with 17 adults, they found that people with substance use disorder face challenges and stigma to seeking care, but also that family members described a lack of available care for their own mental health struggles that came about because of their family members' addiction issues. Family members described feeling anxiety, depression, and in some instances, they had attempted suicide. They blamed the lack of support and social isolation as a result of their loved one's addiction or overdose as the reason behind their mental health. Some people reported finding help in online support groups and community organizations, and some even started their own support groups in the absence of others. After speaking with the interviewees, the authors concluded that while peer support groups fill an important role, people have needs beyond what these largely unfunded and volunteer-based groups can provide, leaving people without adequate support. Okay, so let's talk a bit more in depth about those support groups. One pretty famous one is Al-Anon. Al-Anon is essentially an offshoot of Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA, but for the loved ones of people with alcohol addiction. There are also different Anon groups for other addictions, like Nar-Anon for people with narcotic addictions. In 2012, Timko and colleagues published an article all about the history and impact of Al-Anon. They did this by reviewing existing literature on the group and looking at the group's website. Al-Anon was founded in 1935 by two women whose husbands had alcohol addiction. Timko and colleagues report that there are more than 28,000 Al-Anon groups around the world, serving an estimated 384,000 people. Surveys conducted by the larger Al-Anon organization find that most participants are white, middle-aged women, most were married and had a college degree and were employed. People attended an average of 1.8 in-person meetings a week. The authors go on to explain what they term the active ingredients of 12-step programs like these: bonding and support from other members, goal direction like spirituality, structure, clear expectations of actions, norms, role models, rewarding activities, and promoting coping and self-efficacy. The authors also review prior published studies that have found that attending Al-Anon meetings is associated with relief from isolation and anger, increased strength and hope, and lessened thoughts of violence and suicidal ideation. A different study explored opioid-specific support groups. In 2017, Kelly and colleagues queried a website called learntocope.org, which advertises support groups for loved ones with people with opioid addiction. The authors surveyed 509 people who participated in both online and in-person support groups to answer 3 research questions. 1, who participates? How often and in what ways? 2, what are the demographic and clinical histories of their addicted loved ones? And 3, how do participants benefit? They found, similar to Timko and colleagues' findings, that most participants were middle-aged mothers of opioid-addicted adult male children. People attended meetings several times a month and often developed relationships with other support group members who they then spent time with outside the meetings. Their loved ones with addiction were mostly male, addicted to opioids, and many had a criminal history. Some had experienced overdose. Several participants shared that they believed the support group was helpful because it gave them a better understanding of addiction, gave them coping and communication skills, and reduced their self-blame and stress. Also, the majority of participants had received overdose Narcan training at the meeting and shared that they utilized this training repeatedly when their loved ones overdosed. The final study, Gregg and Tombaron, 2003, developed and evaluated a support group for adolescents with a sibling who used drugs. After interviewing participants, they found that group participants felt better informed, more supported, and less isolated. And parents of participants said that their children had improved communication with an understanding of their sibling who used drugs. Schools, police, and local service agencies were excited about the project and eager to be involved. Collectively, these studies show how beneficial peer support groups can be for loved ones of people who are misusing substances or who have overdosed. Okay. Finally, let's talk about therapy techniques to help people navigate grief after a drug-related death. In 2022, Sperandio and colleagues published an article that examined whether self-compassion and hope helped bereaved people with their post-traumatic growth. To do this, they surveyed 292 individuals whose loved ones had died from an overdose. Essentially, they found that while self-compassion alone aids in post-traumatic growth, hope can amplify and accelerate that process. So, okay, you might be asking, how do you get bereaved therapy clients hopeful? Well, luckily, the authors have some answers. They recommend that therapists should help their clients identify their goals and the steps they need to take to achieve them. Mindfulness practices may also be helpful, and the author suggests that therapists should bring the deceased into the conversation to inspire hope for clients, asking things such as, how do you think your loved one would respond if you accomplished your goal? Or how might your loved one, if they were still here, help you move closer to your goal? Therapists should also practice self-affirmations with their clients so that they recognize their own strength during the grieving process. Now, I'd like to argue that the findings here aren't just limited to one-on-one therapy. I think the principles here of the importance of hope and self-compassion would also be really useful principles for the peer support groups to focus on. With that, we've reached the end of our episode on support groups and treatment for loved ones and our season on substance use disorder, overdose, and loved ones. I hope that this season has brought you new knowledge, compassion, and empathy. And if you or someone you know has been impacted by addiction and or overdose, I hope that this season made you feel heard and maybe even a little bit less alone, because you're not alone. As a reminder, after listening to this episode, if you need support, please contact the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Thank you for listening and learning with me on Season 11 of the ACE IT podcast. Stay tuned for the next season, Season 12, where we'll be talking all about overdose roles and responsibilities. Thank you for listening to the ACE IT podcast. We love hearing from you. So if you have comments, topics to suggest, or some science you'd like us to cover in a future season, please write to me, Danielle Rudes, at Sam Houston State University in Texas. My email is drudes, D-R-U-D-E-S, at shsu.edu. And of course, thank you to the Justice Community Overdose Innovation Network, J-Coin's Coordination and Translation Center, funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, housed at George Mason University, where this podcast originated. Thank you to our fabulous scriptwriter and also my fantastic doctoral student, Bryce Kushmerek McCune. And a huge and heartfelt thank you to the team at Slonky LLC for their wonderful podcast production. As always, tune in again for another episode of ACE IT.